Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Good morning. So nice to see you all in here. Thanks, everybody, for coming this morning. We're going to begin this morning briefly with a land acknowledgement. We honor the unnamed and named artist who accumulated knowledge our research in textiles draws from. We commit to respecting and learning from these enduring traditions as we acknowledge the history and presence of Indigenous people in the Colorado Front Range. We recognize that we occupy the traditional and ancestral lands of the Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyenne peoples, whose rich cultural legacy and heritage continue to shape this region. We honor their deep-rooted traditions, including their skilled textile practices, which embody stories, spiritual beliefs, and communal knowledge passed down through generations. These indigenous communities, intricate beadwork, weaving, and garment making reflect a profound connection to the land and their resilience as artisans and storytellers. Thank you all for joining us today. I am going to get us started. We are so excited to have Kimberly English here, but I have some exciting announcements as well. All right. Usually Laura does this, so I'm excited to have the presenter this morning. So hey everybody, we're the Unstable Design Lab here at CU Boulder. You can see us all in our wonderful matching kind of 1990s superhero outfits here. You can see we're all matching. We're so excited to have you. This is part of our experimental weaving lecture series. Just so you all know, as you signed up, everybody should know that we have the AdaCAD program as well, which also has virtual meetings. So if you guys haven't heard about AdaCAD, it's a wonderful piece of open source software where you can develop different weaving patterns that you can bring into a TC2 or your floor loom. It's pretty awesome. If you guys haven't had a chance to do it, you can see some of our demos that are up on our YouTube channel. You can also join us on April 16th. We're actually going to be using the AdaCAD to do images that morning. So if you have time on April 16th to join us, sign up through the same link on our Instagram or our website, or you can use this QR code as I quickly switch it over. All right. Also, just want to remind everybody that today's lecture is being recorded and that all of our previous lectures are available on our YouTube archive. I know a lot of people have been checking that out. It's a wonderful resource. I really thank all of the teachers and instructors who have been showing it to their students. We get comments from them. That feels really great. Thanks for sharing this information from all of our wonderful speakers. All right. Okay, don't forget, we do have two more speakers coming up. I'll remind you all again on April 2nd. That's a Wednesday. We're going to have Poppy Delta Dawn, and she is the next speaker in our series. All right. Well, this morning, I am going to hand over the floor in just a minute to the wonderful Kimberly English. We are so honored to have her joining us this morning. I've been a longtime fan of Kimberly's work. For me, when I look at Kimberly's work, I think there's something like reverence. There's some reverence that comes from Kimberly's work. There's really a sense of space. It reminds me of the feeling of when you step into like a chapel. There's always this real echo chamber of just the feeling of closeness, just reflection has always been present in Kimberly's work, as well as her very unique ways of displaying it. And Kimberly English, of course, is right now a Wingate Fellow at VCU. So please give Kimberly a round of applause, jump into the chat, say where you're from, and please, Kimberly, let us know, what are you going to show us this morning?
Hi, Stephen. Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen quickly. All right. Everybody can see that?
Yes,
Great.
Kimberly, the web browser showing.
Okay, let's see.
As Kimberly's setting that up, I'll just remind everybody, please put your questions in the chat as they come to you, and then we'll get to them in the last 10 or 15 minutes of our talk this morning. You're good. It looks great, Kimberly.
Okay, great. Thanks, Stephen. Thank you so much for that really amazing introduction, Stephen. And I just want to thank everyone for being here today. Thank you to the Unstable Design Lab for having me. I have been a huge fan of the experimental Weave Talk series for a really long time. So thank you to Laura, to Etta, to Stephen, and to LD today, who is helping kind of facilitate this talk. Okay. I want to preface this talk just by saying that this will shift a little bit more autobiographical than I normally format my artist talks, but I think that this information is really pertinent to the work that I've been making over the last 3 years and the research that I'm embarking on now for an upcoming show, which I will talk about towards the end of my lecture. My home base is in Canton, North Carolina, Western North Carolina, right outside of Asheville. And as Stephen mentioned, right now I am living in Richmond, teaching at VCU, so I'm kind of back and forth between Richmond and Canton. I grew up in a middle class family in rural Georgia. This is an image of me and my cousin, my grandfather, and my dad at our pond in our front yard in the first house that I lived in High Falls, Georgia. And two other things that I just want to mention before getting into the weeds of my work is my relationship with my late father, who was a construction worker and a woodworker. I will talk more about him later, but I think it is important to explain that he built both of the houses that I grew up in, the first of which is here also in High Falls, Georgia. Another thing that I want to mention at the top of this lecture, especially thinking about the idea of experimentation, is I have always been a rule follower. I grew up in a religious, conservative, rural small town where it was advantageous to follow rules blindly, even if they were harmful or didn't make sense to you. I really recently been thinking a lot about the relationship between compliance and defiance in my work and in my personal life, especially as it relates to our current political climate. When I was an undergraduate student at Savannah College of Art and Design, I was making a lot of concept-driven work about my religious upbringing, about my small town. This is a piece that I made in 2014 in undergrad that utilizes bulletins from my hometown church. And looking back at my work from my undergrad years, it's obvious now to me that I really was already interested in this idea of defiance and this kind of errant behavior of the material, especially as it was off the loom and not under tension. Graduate school was really a zooming out experience for me. I think that my undergrad experience really made me fall in love with weaving and with fiber through this romantic lens, but through my research before and during grad school, learning about the reality of the contemporary garment and textile industry, I started to make work about that. And at first, that work was really didactic, which I think was a result of my evangelical upbringing. But I think one of the most powerful things that happened to my work in graduate school is I was really kind of push to change the punctuation of my work from a period to a question mark or a comma, kind of leaving these more poetic forms in space through the textiles I was making. A lot of my work in in grad school focused on deconstruction. This piece is titled 6 Miles and 60 Hours, and I was really interested in the minimalist artist Robert Morris at this time, specifically his work, Box with the Sound of Its Own Making, this kind of presentation of an object where the process of making it was embedded in the final presentation or the final form of the work. And I felt like subconsciously this piece was kind of a response or a reference to that work. And I think that this idea of deconstruction that I was really exploring made sense to me for a lot of reasons. Formally, I really just don't think there's anything more evocative than a draping thread and this kind of isolated thread from a system. I love that it responds to the environment and kind of suggests entropy or aging. But most importantly, I think the deconstruction process reveals the individual within this collective system. Process wise, I feel like this was an action, this deconstruction process was an action that really resensitized my body to the labor of the construction of the garment or of the textile. And I think in relationship to this idea of rule following, To no one's fault, in grad school, I was kind of made to feel like I couldn't weave or I couldn't knit. And so I was just like, okay, well, I'll unknit, I'll unweave. Um, so yeah, a lot of my work at that time was working with secondhand t-shirts. This is another t-shirt piece titled Love Is, which is the brand name of that shirt. And this piece really came from this question of what in the contemporary garment industry is still touched by human hands, which is not fully automated in the production of our clothes. And the answer to that is, although the fabric is automated, whether it's knit or woven, the seams and the collars still have to be regulated by the tension of human hands on the machine. So because of that, I kind of skinned this t-shirt and left the elements that were guided by human hands in the making. And in this piece, there are three tags that are still intact on the garment. There is a tag that tells where it was made in Guatemala. There is a tag that says that it was originally sold at JCPenney. And then there is one from my local thrift store. And I left these tags intact as kind of this marker of this phenomenon of distance that I was really trying to fathom in the work. And I also think that those tags tracked the devaluing of the textile as it gained circulation in the capitalist market. Thinking about that idea of the phenomenon of distance or the effects of our clothes feeling very foreign due to globalization is something that Sophie Thanhauser writes about in her recent book, Worn, A People's History. Highly recommend reading her work on that. This piece was also made in graduate school. This is titled Made in America. And this is made from a Hart Schaffner Marx brand men's business suit. I was thrifting a lot of my material at this time, buying secondhand, and the name Hart Schaffner Marx is what initially drew me to this piece. The brand Hart Schaffner Marx was founded in Chicago in 1887, and it really became this pillar of American-made menswear. And they really pioneered this idea of like suits that you could buy off the rack. And they were really known for their craftsmanship and tailored fit. They are a favorite suit manufacturer of Barack Obama. The brand Hart Schaffner Marx remained steadfast in keeping their manufacturing in the United States, right outside of Chicago specifically. And they were one of the first US companies to establish a unionized workforce. And this happened in 1911 that followed the Chicago garment workers strike, which led to the creation of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America. In 2009, they went bankrupt, and the union was really responsible for really vast media coverage of this event. There were strikes, there were speeches, there were lots of public events where the workers were fighting for their jobs. And ultimately, it led to a buyout that saved the company. And today, they still are made in the United States. But through that research, I wanted to kind of explore this idea of made in America, kind of this fizzling or dissolving notion. And I think the presentation that almost feels like taxidermy or these splayed artifacts, it kind of positions this notion of made in America as this case of preservation of something that will likely soon be a thing of the past. And this work has the business suit parts kind of splayed on the wall. It has a video of me ripping apart the suit and then a sound piece that kind of collages these fractures of the audio from the media coverage, the strikes, the chants, with the hum of a sewing machine kind of going over and drowning out those voices. Although the work that I've talked about so far has focused on secondhand garments that are largely speaking to like the capitalist system and our the circulation of them in the market, I was also making some personal work at this time too, kind of following that same ethos of deconstruction. And I was working with kind of these heirloom textile objects that were passed down through my family. This cotton blanket was my grandmother's, given to my mom, and then given to me. And I was really thinking about this work, my interpersonal relationships with the people in my family, and kind of the invisible labor that was done inside the home. At this time, I was really interested in the writing of Paul Virilio, who was a French philosopher and cultural theorist, really known for his work on speed and technology, and this idea of dramology, which examines the impact of acceleration on society and perception. And the text that I was looking at most closely was Unknown Quantity, which really explores this relationship between technological acceleration and catastrophe, kind of arguing that modern disasters, both natural and human made, are this inherent byproduct of progress. In that book, he famously says, to invent the ship is to invent the shipwreck. And I think about that a lot in my work as someone who is making these objects that are going on to live in the world. I also found Glenn Adamson's Soft Power at this time, in which he makes this formal case for the flaccid state of fiber, kind of embracing the idea of the drape, or this singular thread not under tension, as this systemic reflection of surrender or even insufficiency within the system. This was the first piece that I made after graduate school, titled Blood, Breath, Gradient. After grad school, I really felt the pull of the loom. I wanted to go back to the loom to weave, but really wanted to apply these new ideas and this new research through material to what I was weaving. This piece utilizes found cotton warp and then deconstructed t-shirts as the weft, and these are woven as an overshot pattern. And although these materials seem disparate, they actually feel really connected to me. T-shirts are this kind of ubiquitous global commodity, and they're emblematic of labor exploitation embedded in capitalist systems and colonial histories. They are often produced in low-wage countries, as we know, where labor is cheap and conditions are harsh and unsafe. The widespread consumption of t-shirts also highlights the globalized trade networks and the homogenization of culture, as these really simple garments have circulated across the world. On the other hand, Appalachian overshot weaving is rooted in the region's colonial past and the labor of women in rural Appalachia, and it kind of carries its own histories of industrialization, labor, and resistance, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. But I think the use of the weaving pattern alongside the t-shirt references this tension between labor forms, kind of pitting the artisanal, feminized labor and localized labor of the past up against this Appalachian mass-produced globalized system. Shortly after grad school, I received a gift that kind of like changed the way that I was thinking about material, changed my work for the next 4 years, and kind of sent me down this rabbit hole working with denim. My dear friend gave me a bolt of one of the last bolts of selvage denim from cone mills, cone mills in Greensboro named White Oak. And this was one of the last bolts of selvage denim produced on US soil by the company before they shifted their production to Mexico. At that time, they were the only American factory making selvage denim, and they unfortunately closed in 2017 after 112 years in business, again, moved their production to Mexico. What is really interesting to me about the history of American salvage denim, there are kind of three things that are really interesting to me about it. Um, Indigo and cotton are used to make denim, which are two of the roots of American imperialism. The timeline of American salvage denim also directly reflects to the rise and fall of the American industrial engineering and its labor force. And the other thing that I find really fascinating about this is American selvage denim had largely died out and was being produced. Selvage denim was kind of capitalized in Japan, and then American consumers were so interested in that market that then they brought the selvage denim production back to American companies. So now Cone Denim is producing selvage denim again because there was this inherent interest in Japanese selvage denim. And there's this GQ article from this week that Stephen will drop in the chat or add in the YouTube notes, but there is one remaining selvage denim factory here in the United States. It's called Vidalia Mills in Louisiana, and they are actually closing next month. This is the only American industrial scale selvage denim manufacturer. And I think that this evolution of selvage denim production from its peak in the American industrial era to its decline and then revival based on these global trends really reflects broader shifts in manufacturing, in labor, and in cultural values in the US. Today, as we are watching these factories closing, it kind of serves as this reminder of the shifting landscape of American craftsmanship and the impact of global forces on our local industries. This piece is titled Untitled Net and was made from that bolt of cone denim, white oak, selvage denim. And I was reading Elizabeth Wayland Barber at this time, who famously wrote Women's Work, The First 20,000 Years. And in that book, she kind of makes this case that there's an Iron Age, there's a Bronze Age, there should be a Fiber Age or a String Age. And she talks a lot about these fiber-based tools like nets, snares, bows that really allowed humans to kind of conquer the natural world. And I was thinking about that in relationship to civilization and to what was happening at the time. I was making this in 2020 during the COVID lockdown, during Trump's first presidency. And I was thinking a lot about isolation and safety and the system that is supposed to keep you safe. There was also a personal reference in this work as well. I was kind of thinking macro and micro with this work as well, because at this time I was becoming estranged from my father and was thinking about this fallibility of the system and this deconstruction action of kind of isolating the individual from the whole to kind of cause this metaphor of estrangement through the material. This work is titled Far from the Tree and is also made from that bolt of denim. The scale of this is much bigger. This is 3 feet by 9 feet, which is kind of hard to tell in the image. And this felt really related to the net piece that I just showed. It's using the same process of deconstruction, but I wanted to focus less on imagery and again, kind of return to that idea of the errant behavior of the material once it was not under tension. And the title here relates to my relationship with my parents, specifically my father at this time, becoming estranged from him. But it also refers to the tree of knowledge mutation theory that was really popularized by Yuval Harari. And this was a theorized cognitive mutation that happened sometime between 70,000 and 30,000 years ago, slowly over time. And this is when Homo sapiens began to exhibit behaviors that really set them apart from other human species. We're thinking about art and symbolism, thinking about complex language, and really large-scale cooperation. And this idea of being able to see something abstract or believe in something that wasn't tangible really allowed us to set up the myths and systems that we have today. Thinking about my practice, my interest in industry, in religion, in Southern culture, in the effects of capitalism, all thinking about these as forms of myth making, I think that this piece really marked this kind of shift in the way I was thinking about my research interests. Okay, I'm gonna go through the next couple pieces a little bit more quickly. I'm just being cognizant of time. This work is titled The Animal That Became God and is titled after Yuval Harari's writing as well. And this work is utilizing not selvage denim, this is Mexican denim that is put in these panels with a center panel, which I dyed and wove. I was really, again, kind of feeling this pull back to the loom and wanted to think about this juxtaposition between creation and dismantling. The subject matter here is these two hands, both of which are taken or appropriated from the creation of Adam and the sculpture outside of the Chernobyl site. Again, thinking about kind of this juxtaposition between creation and destruction. Again, I'm just going to go through these a little bit more quickly. So these next three pieces were all dyed and woven denim on my floor loom. And these are all hand-picked. So rather than using a jacquard or a digital weaving tool, I'm weaving a twill and then changing that pattern by hand as I'm going. And there's the net again. So you can see with this one, there are these really exaggerated warp floats that again are kind of revisiting this personal metaphor of a net, but are really kind of exaggerating the isolated nature of the threads that I'm leaving unwoven. I want to really quickly just mention my process for these works because it's something that I found really empowering when working on them. I was not using a traditional cartoon. There wasn't an image like a transparency laying on top or a cartoon on the bottom. I instead installed a projector from the ceiling of my studio with all these guide marks on it and would use that to kind of like create a runway for my loom and scoot it up and scoot it back as I was weaving. And through this process, I really realized I needed to get myself on a digital, like I needed to get on a TC2. So in 2023, I had the amazing opportunity to attend Praxis Fiber Workshop's Digital Weaving Lab residency. And I had woven on a jacquard loom in undergrad, but very briefly, and I felt like it didn't really click with the things that I was doing and didn't feel like something that was going to be sustainable in my practice. However, I think returning to Praxis in 2023 completely changed and transformed my work. I was initially working with the structure of denim, working with this 3-1 or 1-3 twill pattern. And one of the first pieces I made during this residency was pushing this idea of kind of the falling apart or like the fallibility of the structure through excess rather than through isolation or deconstruction. So for this piece, I expanded that 1-3 twill sequence and expanded it for every panel in this piece. So for you weaving nerds, the structure for this, the first panel is 1-3, then it's 2-6, 4-12, 12-24, 16-48, and then 32-96. So there are some real chunky floats in this that you can see, especially in that last panel, which is quite precarious. This was my first time ever on a TC2, and it really fundamentally changed the way that I see weaving, how I visualize pattern, and now how I'm drafting patterns as well. Something that I really responded to about this weaving experience was the speed of weaving on a TC2. I know this is something that weavers talk about all the time, is this kind of battle between intuition and planning, because there is some element of planning when weaving, but I think that the speed really allowed me to kind of be intuitive and trust myself and allowed it to feel a little bit more like drawing, which will make sense with some of the work I'm going to show in just a moment. At Praxis that year in 2023, my world kind of totally shifted upside down when my then estranged father died unexpectedly. And it's strange to talk about because it is one of the most like cosmic things I've ever experienced. I don't think that I would believe all of the coincidences if I didn't experience them myself. Yeah, there were many coincidences that happened that week and since then that really gave me this strange comfort in my grief over losing him. For example, the colors in this weaving on the right that I was weaving on the day that he passed are uncanny in the shirt that he was wearing on the day that I was born, which I didn't even know until I started preparing for this lecture. While I was there, while I was at Praxis, I kept thinking about him, and I don't think that was uncommon because I had made work about my family and him before. And I also know that weaving kind of drums up these subconscious things. But this felt really different, and I was making this series of drawings that I knew were about him in some way, and then those were kind of abstracted into these weavings that you also see on the right here. I want to give just a little bit of context about my dad and our relationship. Yeah, this is him with one of our dogs growing up. My dad was deeply, deeply proud of his Southern heritage. He was a neo-Confederate, and he found a lot of identity in where he grew up and his high school, which was and is still named Robert E. Lee High School. He was also a tinkerer. He was really interested in wood and how wooden joints fit together, how wooden objects became symbolic. And I don't think that I would be an artist without seeing his practice. Um, at the same time, he was really brilliant and he was creative and he loved to play jokes on people and laugh with his family. But for my entire life, our relationship was oppositional. I saw us as binary entities living in the same house, and we slowly became estranged between 2020 and 2022. Our relationship is something that I did not talk about. It caused me a lot of shame, which is not lost on me now that I'm talking about it in this very public way, which I find ironic. But I do think that this idea of like public and private perception is something that's really deeply ingrained in this work that I'll talk a little bit more about later. But I want to preface this work by saying that this body of work that I made after his passing was much more concerned with like haptic healing or kind of getting lost in the process rather than the technicality of the work. Shortly after his death, I was reading at the recommendation of a dear friend, Casey, Sally Mann's memoir, Hold Still, which is such a beautiful piece of writing that accompanies a lot of her work. These are two pieces from her Southern Landscape series. And in that book, she really talks about her recognition of the flaws of the South and Appalachia while also refusing to see it as a lost cause. And one of the things that really informed this body of work in her writing is her ability to talk about this idea of loss or absence as this distinctly Southern notion. And she talks about this through a combination of historical weight, of cultural memory, and also a personal experience. She kind of intertwines the South's past of slavery, of the Civil War, and the kind of decaying grandeur alongside her personal relationship with the South. And in the book, she has this quote that I'm going to paraphrase, but she says something to the effect of referring to the time in your life when your parents are dying or when you're preparing for your parents to die. And she says you spend your whole life with your back up against this door, trying to keep them out. And then in an instant, the threshold collapses and you're spending the rest of your life picking up the splinters and trying to make sense of it. And I really can't think of a better way to describe how it felt to lose my father, especially given the context of our relationship. But I knew that that idea of the threshold is what I wanted this work to be called and what I wanted the show to be called. Kind of this liminal space between life and death, between estrangement and acceptance. And so this body of work was exhibited in East Tennessee State University's Slocum Galleries last fall. And to finish this body of work, I returned to the TC2 6 months after my dad passed. And I really wanted to kind of synthesize these ideas of opposition, of myths, of Southern lore and labor, and kind of set them against this background or this backdrop of the Deep South. When I was making this work, I could not stop thinking about double weave and overshot structures. At first, for no other reason other than their formal qualities, that I really liked how they looked. But I also think there is something structurally about them that they have in common, in which there's this idea of what's visible and what's not revealed, and that you can build these really complex systems with multiple wefts. Over time, double weave overshot became kind of the driving structure that I was using in this body of work. And I cannot talk about this structure and this experience without shouting out Chad Troyer, who I know is in the audience. Chad was working at Praxis when I was there, and I was just kind of like word vomiting on him all these ideas and how I was trying to make these structures symbolic of the content that I was representing, and Chad really kind of helped me conceptualize these patterns as double weave overshot. I think that this idea of double weave felt distinctly appropriate for this body of work because it felt really resonant with my relationship with my father, kind of always out of sync, but truly cut from the same cloth, sharing DNA, sharing space, whether we liked it or not. But I also think that the qualities of overshot felt resonant as well. There are these two weft threads, there's pattern and there's the tabby thread. And the pattern is kind of the showy one that you see, but it is really comprised of these large skips where it's jumping over lots of warp threads that kind of compromises the structural integrity of the fabric, which necessitates having your tabby thread as your ground cloth to give it some structure. And I think that these structures, specifically overshot, relate to this notion of loss or absence that I was really kind of hung up on after reading Sally Mann's work. This piece is titled Through Which to Catch and was woven on the TC2. Again, the net kind of thinking about this as a personal metaphor. And I wanted to create this system with this work. The standing structure is made by my best friend from childhood, Madison, with wood from my father's wood shop. And the piece is kind of latticed or splayed onto this structure using construction line that I found in my dad's truck after his passing. And suspended from the weaving are these two beads that, to my knowledge, are the only beads that he made. He turned on his lathe, and they're tied to the weaving with kind of this gently plied yarn that over time kind of unplies and plies in the gallery space. There's kind of this gentle motion that's constantly happening with them. Okay, this piece is titled The Devil's Wife and is about the phenomenon of the sun shining while it's raining. And where I grew up in rural Georgia, and if anybody else is from the Southeast, you've probably heard this before. When the sun is shining and it's raining at the same time, we used to say, oh, the devil is beating his wife, or the devil is spanking his wife. And it was very flippantly used, and it's something that I really never thought about until I got out of the South, actually. And I knew I wanted to make a piece to respond to this statement. I want to read a paraphrased journal entry that I wrote while I was weaving this piece at Praxis. It says, "This piece is about contradiction. I have always been struck by the improbability of my dad and me existing on the same planet, let alone being connected by blood. As a child, I noticed it in simple things. His hatred of bananas, his love of peeps, and my exact opposite preference. As I got older, those differences became ideological. Yet after his passing, I see him in me. When he died, I stayed at my residency and wove all day. It felt strange, maybe even callous, but it was what I needed to do. I thought about how he would retreat to his woodshop on holidays, unable to sit in the closeness of family. I understand that now. He loved that I was an artist. He once had a portrait I drew as his phone screensaver. He loved parts of me, I loved parts of him. In the South, we call it the devil spanking his wife when the sun shines while it rains. Two things happening at once that shouldn't, but do. That's what this work is about. Contradiction, distance, recognition, love and absence, the ways we inherit and the ways that we resist." I want to also mention with this piece the process of making it. I was weaving these patterns of the sun and the rain and was weaving this very gentle tabby line to give myself a pattern to cut and piece the work together once it was off loom. And you can see on the right image that there is this intricate quilting pattern that is referencing an Appalachian overshot weaving pattern titled American Bloom, which I felt was a really fitting reference given this metaphor of the sun and the rain. Continuing to think about inheritance and resistance, this work is titled Limitation of Instinct, and it depicts an ant mill, which, if anyone is not familiar, an ant mill is this deadly phenomenon where a group of army ants get separated from their main trail, and they begin following each other in a continuous loop. And because they navigate on pheromone trails, they become trapped in this cycle endlessly marching until they die. And I think that this is really this illustration of blindly following patterns that are set out for us to our demise. I think that, yeah, this piece really is, for me, largely about the capacity to break patterns and the risk inherent in doing so. This work, just formally speaking, I know that I've experimented with a lot of different ways of representing subject matter in my work, but this feels most closely aligned to what I'm working with now, kind of this ambiguity between the figure and the ground that's kind of embedded into these overshot patterns. Okay, again, just because of time, I'm gonna kind of skip through this one. This one is called Snag, and it's a woven image of my childhood backyard. I can talk more about that in the Q&A if anyone is interested. This work is titled Lockstep, and there's kind of this coupling happening in this composition between these two joint pieces. This is referencing the last piece of work that my dad made, where he was trying to figure out the joinery of this really beautiful serving tray. And yeah, the joint is a reference to one of the corners of that piece. There's kind of this gesture happening in this piece where you can't really tell if the pieces are moving closer or further away from each other. And again, thinking about process for this one, there is kind of this blue band that's happening in the center of the weaving. And this is something that was not intentional. My image file and my pattern file were not syncopated. One of them had an even number of pixels and one had an odd number of pixels. And I think that that was one of these kind of like happy accidents that happened that I'm going to continue to include intentionally in the work that I'm making now. Okay, this piece is Lee's Surrender and is another woven and then pieced work. And this one is referencing 19th century coverlets. There is not a lot of history known about overshot patterns brought to America by colonists and immigrants. But Lee's Surrender is one of the most famous Appalachian overshot drafts. It was first drafted in the late 19th century. And like I said, there's not a lot of history about these. We don't know who made this. We don't know what they were thinking when they made this pattern. But one of my favorite resources that I found in my research is Eliza Calvert Hall's A Book of Handwoven Coverlets. And she was a novelist, but she's writing this like pseudo history book about these patterns. And I think there is kind of this really blurry line in her writing between fact and speculation that I've actually found really helpful and prompting in thinking about these patterns that were largely fraught with histories of colonization and oppression. But in her writing about this draft, about Lee's surrender, she asks the draft, she says, were you named in sorrow or were you named in triumph? And I think that this idea of talking to this pattern or continuing this conversation has really felt like what I'm trying to do with this work, to continue this conversation rather as thinking of these as historical patterns that we can't use or we can't touch. The panels from this work are taken from the traditional draft. They're woven in the traditional draft. The McLean house in the center, that is what the image is of, which was the actual site of Lee's surrender. Just a moment to acknowledge the symbolism of the McLean house. It is historically important because it was not just the site of Lee's surrender, but it was also the home of Wilmer McLean and his family. He moved his entire family from Manassas, Virginia, where the first major battle of the Civil War took place, because he wanted to completely escape the war. So the fact that his house became the site of the surrender is ironic, but I think there's even more to this idea. There is this, I think, important nuance to how we remember the surrender at the McLean house, not in a more generalized location like the Appomattox Courthouse. I think the Appomattox Courthouse has kind of become shorthand for where the Confederacy surrendered, but it was in this private residence that was the true site of the event. And I think that this distinction brings forward the personal nature of history, where the intimate private spheres become entangled with these larger public events. Like the history of the McLean house, where the home of one man became a key site in our history, I think today's political struggles, such as arrests and surveillance and public action, are increasingly playing out in intimate private spheres of citizens' lives. And I think that this tension is a reminder of how the personal is political and how these histories, both public and private, shape our collective memory. All right, this is another one that I'm going to skim over. This work is made from from wood from my father's wood shop that I made on the anniversary of his death. Okay, this is the last piece I'm going to talk about today. This is titled Heirloom, and this work is made in reference to an image I took of a tomato that I grew in my garden in 2023. And I made this after learning at my dad's funeral that we planted our very first garden on the same year. And I think that this was just, again, some strange sense of comfort that some things that we inherit are really worth saving and cherishing. Before we jump into the Q&A, I would love to just talk for 1 minute about my current research for my upcoming exhibition. In the United States, there have been three really crucial hand weaving revivals. The first was in the 1870s, which is known as the Colonial Revival. There was one in the 1920s where there was this specific interest in Appalachian weaving that was spurred by settlement schools and led to selling blankets and coverlets from Appalachia. And then there was the Bicentennial Revival in 1976. I'm particularly interested in the 1920s revival and how that revival really popularized hand weaving through these settlement schools. One of the women that was one of the key players in this history is Frances L. Goodrich, which is pictured here. And she was a missionary turned craft advocate that founded Allenstan Cottage Industries in North Carolina, which became the Southern Highland Craft Guild. And her brown book is an amazing resource for these Appalachian overshot patterns. And her kind of journey of reviving this craft history started with this coverlet that is pictured here, this brown double bow knot coverlet that was gifted to her that completely sparked this obsession where she found that these women in the valleys of Western North Carolina knew how to do these skills, but it was a very isolated knowledge sharing. So she kind of facilitated this sharing of knowledge of spinning, of dyeing, of reading drafts, of setting up the loom, and of actually weaving these coverlets. She really branded overshot weaving as this uniquely Appalachian tradition and kind of reframed it from this regional functional necessity to this commodity that was particularly significant for the women of Appalachia during the Great Depression. And I think that this history raises a lot of questions about individualism, about knowledge exchange, about Southern stereotypes, and the commodification of tradition within and without a capitalist system. Thinking about that idea of individualism and how Goodrich's efforts, while they did preserve these craft histories, they also played into this broader trend of kind of romanticizing the American individual. I'm thinking about American media like Westerns like Little House on the Prairie, even the contemporary TV series Alone, that really all embody this idea of independence, hard work, and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. But I think that these histories, these ideas that are really pervasive in American culture, overlook the interdependence required for survival, particularly in the context of rural America. Hurricane Helene hit Western North Carolina in September of 2024, which I know many of you are familiar with as it impacted a lot of the Southeast United States. It was completely catastrophic for Western North Carolina, and it was it was the first natural disaster that I have ever experienced, and I know that it likely will not be the last. And I think that this experience really served as this stark reminder of how fragile this myth of the self-made, self-reliant individual truly is. I think seeing neighbors deliver water and food and insulin to strangers was really one of the most powerful things that I have ever experienced. I think that in the wake of the storm, these systems that we trust, like our economic social, and even personal survival strategies were all kind of exposed as being inadequate up against the power of nature. Um, Experiences like this, I think, force us to confront the complexity of survival and the fallacy of individualism in a world that's shaped both by human systems and nature's unpredictability. I think in woven and in interpersonal systems, strength comes not from just a single thread, but from the tension and support of many threads together. On that note of collaboration, I just want to give a shout out to the students that I'm sharing space with and knowledge with this semester. This is a project that I think embodies these ideas into a physical object. This was a coverlet that was drafted by me, woven by my students this semester, kind of serving as this parting reminder that creativity and making is not ever really an individual act. Thank you so much. That's it.
Thank you, Kimberly. Oh my gosh. Can we give a preliminary round of applause to Kimberly? We will have questions. Yes, snaps.
Thank you.
We're so happy to have you. Thank you so much for your talk. So much to consider. And so, folks, I see there's a couple questions in the chat already, and we will get to those in just a minute. I wanted to ask you a little bit to go back to that idea of the snag piece that you.
Yeah.
Feel free to pull that up if you want to. Also, no pressure if that's annoying.
No, I can
Um,
totally pull that up. Yeah.
and talk a little bit more. I was really interested in like how thinking through that tree pattern, like the kind of
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you were looking at the overshot patterns and then the like trees in the forest, if that was part of your influence, or I just thought that was evocative, the way that that came into conversation with the other works that you were near it.
Yeah, I think this piece feels most similar to that center panel of Lee's Surrender of the McLean House because I'm taking this imagery, this photographic reference, and then making it positive and negative space. This one actually has three woven structures. It's the light blue, the dark blue, and then this, yeah, this overshot kind of skipping texture that's happening. And this work really came from just a childhood memory where I was thinking about feeling safe at home, and I loved riding my four-wheeler with my brothers in the backyard and was thinking about this space as again something that I'm very familiar with, but that's shifting kind of in my memory. And this idea of transparency that is allowed by speed, where if you go by a row of pine trees fast enough, you can see straight through to the neighbor's yard or to the creek. And I think that that idea of these boundaries and ownership as I'm getting older and thinking about my relationship with the land and how I'm projecting myself and my interests on where I live. That's kind of where this piece came from.
Oh man, that's beautiful. Thank you so much. It also, it reminds me a lot of the quilting aspects that come into your work too. And I think also Nathan Beck here has made a great comment that I think ties right into that. Nathan said, I noticed, also Nathan says, you're amazing. And then I noticed the strong presence of time throughout your work, production, repetition, beginning, end, birth, death, historical, contemporary, composition, decomposition. So looking at this, and I mean, this is a question a lot of weavers get, but what is your relationship to time in this work particularly or generally? I see it, just to build on Nathan's comment too, there's so many ways in which you're layering time into your work, bringing in these historical references, talking about denim. That denim piece you made at Praxis, I want it. Did somebody buy it? Can I have it?
No, yeah, I love that question. I think that that's something that I don't know. I mean, I've made pieces in the past that have like an actual durational element, and I haven't really thought about this work through that lens. But I think you're totally right. I think about this fusing of passed down histories and of contemporary perspectives and how that is shifting this perception of time is something that feels really integral to this work and this practice. I also think that time as being synonymous with labor and with work is what I'm thinking about as well, especially, weaving as and textiles as being rooted in this working class media traditionally, and the time that it takes to produce the work is also an element of that as well. Yeah, I think that's a really great question. It's something I'm going to think on.
Yeah, definitely. I think when I see your work, I think of like even Ann Wilson's work and
Oh, thank
parallels
you.
there where her family comes into the
Yeah.
conversation, but also speaking to these richer, longer textile histories. So it's really beautiful to see that. Heather had a few questions here as well. Firstly, she wanted to know about your relationship to color choices, and I see a lot of like deep blue. So I'm assuming there's a denim like Southern tradition happening there. And obviously, everybody here wants to know where you harvest and grow your own indigo, because obviously you do, right? No, just kidding. But Kimberly's like, I can't do it all. We'll call Roland Ricketts and they'll give us some indigo. Can you talk a little bit about your color choices that you make in your work, Kimberly?
Yeah, totally. I think in graduate school I was working with that red and white
Yeah.
primarily, and I genuinely think I was afraid of color, and I was really limiting my color palette to things that felt directly symbolic, and thinking about labor, feminized labor. At that time, I was thinking about red and white as kind of the blood and the breath of this like visible and invisible labor that was happening. And then I think after grad school, really leaning into the denim is kind of where this blue infatuation started. I do not grow and harvest my own indigo yet, but that is actually something that is on the docket soon, is planting a natural dye garden. But yeah, I think that my relationship with blue really started with using indigo and then kind of building out a color palette that felt reminiscent of the South and of growing up in the South and of Appalachia. I have been really, kind of grew up as like anti-purple. Like I would never wear purple. I would never like use purple when I was coloring. And I'm really becoming very fond of the color purple being in Appalachia. I think that there is this like pervasive purple of the landscape that is happening that I it's kind of sneaking up on me and sneaking into the work like in Snag. You can see this lavender that's happening here. But I do think a lot of the work is pulling from also historical coverlets and coverings. The Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts is an amazing resource for looking at these naturally dyed, naturally acquired color palettes that feel like the place that they were made from because they are made from the place. And I think that I've been referencing those a lot, thinking about, yeah, kind of using that lens as applied to color theory as a way to reference these older textiles, but also make something that feels symbolic and personal to my upbringing.
Mm, that's awesome. I love the colors that happens in those old textiles and like I was wondering like where, especially with the natural dyes, you're always like,
Yeah.
what was
They
it?
list the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts. They list a lot of the dye, which has also been really. I've learned a lot just by looking at all these older patterns that have this transparency with how they were made.
Awesome. Chad, your friend Chad Troyer has an amazing question for you this morning. I'll read it verbatim. You mentioned boundaries, but is that something you're thinking about beyond the boundaries of land, like interpersonal boundaries, the boundaries of one layer of cloth to another, either double weave or quilting?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that I started thinking about that idea of boundary when I was reading Sally Mann making this work about threshold. Yeah, thinking about interpersonal relationships and where things converge and where they have necessity to spread apart and to go separate ways. But I'm also thinking a lot about my father's relationship with the land that we owned growing up. And now being someone who has land, I think that I'm having to continuously like check myself and acknowledge the privilege of owning space and what that even means in response to like public and private land. So yeah, I think that that idea of boundaries is again kind of this like micro and macro lens through which I'm viewing my work and my relationship with where I'm making, but also in proximity to whom I'm making about.
Yeah, I think that was a great question, Chad, because when I think about your work, I think you sometimes defy the boundary of like a weaving on a wall. I mean, didn't even talk about it today, but one of the things that always strikes me with your work is you're very successful in making weavings into sculptures. And you didn't show a lot of that work here today, but for when you think about boundaries, I think there's like a questioning of like, is this an art object? Is it a quilt? And And I love the way you display your things and hang them, like the piece you did with your dad's beads. Is always something that's like really compelling in your work. Okay, one last question. I just wanted to say you're great. One last question for you, Kimberly, coming from Allison, that I think maybe will bring together some of the ideas we were thinking about today. Would you be willing to talk a little bit more about the connection of wefts between freestanding weaving and blood, breath, and gradient? And how do you make the pieces connect? And is it something you might explore more conceptually in later work? Just thinking about your comments on how people are like threads connecting.
Yeah, I think that is such a great question. I'll talk a little bit just like technically about this process. So I wove the red panel first and kind of fed off the weft to the left side, wove the right panel, fed it off to the right, and then wove the center and was kind of pulling from both of them. Um, and I really, it was a very like complicated process, but it felt very intuitive the way that these things are interacting. It also felt like I was kind of making up the rules as I went, which ding 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 experimental. But I think that that idea of like having this drape that maybe isn't embedded into the structure is something that I am thinking about. I think that I'm actually right now designing some work where there are these panels of woven overshot where there is deconstruction happening within the piece as well. So it's kind of this like you can't really tell where the pattern starts and where the pattern ends. This certainly could be something that I return to in the future. I think that right now I'm really pushing, like Stephen kind of mentioned, like the sculptural quality of like making these things stand out from the wall or connect to each other between planes. Um, so yeah, we'll see if this works its way back in. But I think that yeah, that symbolism of wefts as individuals is something that I keep coming back to in my work, especially through this idea of overshot. Right now, I'm also working on this kind of side project where I'm making a book about the overshot structure, thinking about tabby, thinking about pattern, and how do we identify with making the routines of our lives complementary to the structure and the system that we're building together? Yeah, that's a great question.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you so much. When you finish your book, maybe you come back and do a book talk with
Totally.
and walk us through that overshot structure. I want to thank you so much for being here today. I've really enjoyed this conversation. There's so much poignancy in your work in this time, and so thank you so much, Kimberly. Can get one more round of applause for Kimberly, some silent claps and love up here on the screen. I want to remind everybody that our next talk in the series is going to be on April 7th at 9 a.m. Denver time. Poppy Delta Dawn, our artist in residence. If you're joining us locally from the Front Range region, Poppy's talk will also be offered in person. So I'll be sending out an email about that early next week. So just keep your eyes peeled. And if you want to come to CU campus, and you can join us in person for Poppy's talk, as well as everybody here virtually. Thank you all for joining us. And thank you so much, Kimberly. Everybody have a great weekend.
Thank you, everyone.